Welcome everyone. So we're back after this workshop. I hope you're still energetic and paying attention because it's worth it. The next speaker is James Davies, and I will introduce him briefly to you. He has worked in the software business for 30 years, both in the management consulting side as well as in software startups. He also worked in the US for approximately 20 years, and he has a very broad experience in strategy and in portfolio management. So I think he brings a lot of the topics together also that have been discussed earlier today. The company that James is representing is i-nexus. This is a company that has existed for 15 years now, and they offer software products related to strategic planning and strategy implementation. And they basically cover the cycle of plan, execute, track. And but James will not be talking about the software solutions today. He will be addressing a topic called adaptive strategies. You can see it already on the slides. And also about continuous strategic planning, and also about the role of data and artificial intelligence in that. So I wish you all fun with and inspiration with the presentation of James.
Okay, thanks, Laurent. Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. Hopefully this isn't the graveyard shift after lunch where you're all trying to snooze, with your videos off. And actually, this reminds me of something my wife says. She's a teacher, and during COVID, she had to teach pupils that she'd never met, never seen, because of remote learning. They have their video cameras off and they're on mute, which makes it very difficult. But good afternoon, everybody. And yes, I'm a product guy, but I'm here today to talk about something that our customers are showing a lot of interest in, and in fact, the market is showing a lot of interest in. And that's the question of, how do we make our strategic planning more continuous? And there are various labels associated with that kind of philosophy or concept. And I just picked one, which is adaptive strategy. So, you'll see both sides of my career play out in the next 30 minutes in terms of the slides. Thinking like a product guy, I want to decompose things and understand the relationships between things. And as a consultant, I like to draw pretty pictures in PowerPoint. PowerPoint engineering, or view graph engineering, as somebody once called it. So really, the presentation has two parts to it. The first part are my thoughts and observations and conclusions, kind of looking at adaptive strategy in detail, and some of the best practices out there. And then obviously working for a software company that helps companies to execute strategy, I'd be remiss without bringing us back to technology very briefly at the end. But no death by PowerPoint, and certainly no screens. So to me, kind of the story starts, 2020, going into the 2020s, just expecting a great deal of uncertainty. And I love this quote from the IMF, and particularly the timing. So COVID was just around the corner, just beginning to emerge, and the expectation in the market was, a high degree of uncertainty. And as you heard earlier, uncertainty and volatility are cousins, close cousins. Volatility comes from uncertainty, and in turn, volatility can perpetuate uncertainty. So in all of this, what we're seeing is a transformation between what people used to call the new normal, which was much reduced certainty, let's say, to no normal, where, frankly, none of us in this virtual room today know what's going to happen in the next, 12 to 18 months, not the least of all because of COVID and all of its implications. So that was January. Along comes COVID and turns everything on its head. And there are just a couple of quotes here from some EY research, just really pushing the point home that COVID is a catalyst for change. Companies are going to have to transform the way they think, their business models, their practices, their operations, in order to survive and thrive. And what does that mean for us? We're all interested in strategic planning. Well, as Gartner puts it, kind of the traditional approach to annual strategic planning just isn't going to cut it anymore. The fact is we decide 15 months ahead of the end of a planning cycle that we're going to do the following things. We then largely myopically go off and do these things and do our best to deliver on our strategic objectives. And then at the end of the planning cycle, we look at how we did. And regardless of whether or not we executed on that strategy, there's a fair chance and an increasing chance that that's the wrong strategy now. So, this is back to, adaptive strategy and what it means to be adaptive, which in terms of a dictionary definition is an ability or tendency to adapt to different situations. And, the list below is not a comprehensive list. And actually I missed speed out, which is vital. But responsiveness and flexibility, kind of an operational capability, and then agility that builds upon that flexibility and the ability to respond, and enabling us to be much more adaptive. And there are absolutely a ton of best practices, as you would expect. I could have picked any number. And being interested in strategic planning, these models are quite fascinating. And what you'll see is kind of a distillation of some of those concepts. And I have a kind of a broader presentation that has the models themselves, but alas, I don't have time to go through those today. But some of the ones I touched upon were BCG's concepts of always-on strategy, Agile itself, scaled Agile framework, which is a way by which you can scale Agile adoption, not the least of all beyond technology and into the enterprise at large. And then Gartner's adaptive strategy, which was a report that was published mid last year. And out of all of that, really kind of emerged for me that there are kind of three modes to strategic planning. There's the comfortable zone that we all live in of annual planning, and everything's aligned with the calendar and the budget cycle. So traditional annual planning. And off to the far right, what we have is what I called full agile. And I'm not just talking about the delivery teams adopting agile methods to deliver on the objectives and the activities and the work streams and what have you, but truly being agile with respect to strategy. What Kearney calls now and next. That their thesis was that annual strategic planning is obsolete and it's being replaced with now and next. And the difference between these lies in full agile not having the concept of an annual strategic plan. It literally is. We're going to do these things, and then along the way, we're going to decide what we're going to focus on next. And then in the middle, I called it hybrid, where you're taking kind of the best of both worlds, where you still got the annual strategic plan as your quote North Star quote for the coming year, but then you're incrementally delivering that through a set of delivery cycles or sprints, and we'll come to that in a minute. And then anything else that you're not biting off immediately in terms of implementation then naturally becomes a planned backlog. And underneath that, you can see stagnation under annual planning. It's just not going to work as uncertainty just keeps on increasing. Evolution, that seems to me to be the logical path forward, is to evolve from annual strategic planning and find a way to become much more adaptive and responsive, but within that annual planning cycle or constraint, depending on how you look at it. And then full agile, which to me is revolution. And that's not something I really talk about in this presentation. And I'm not so sure how prevalent that method is, truly thinking in terms of quarterly planning cycles. So the rest of the presentation really focuses on hybrid. And kind of thinking it through as I did the research and started to think about, so you can see the product guide coming out. To me, if you take annual planning on the left, everything's aligned in that cadence. You have an annual planning horizon. It's an annual planning cycle, and then your delivery cycle is essentially annual. And if you start to tease those apart and decouple them, then you start to paint a different picture where you have a planning horizon, you have one or more planning cycles. Then within those, you could have delivery cycles, and underneath that, you have your sprints. So not dissimilar to some of the concepts from Scaled Agile Framework, but thinking in terms of kind of decomposition and introducing logical junctures when you can take a step back and say, look, has anything changed? Do I need to respond to anything? So that to me is all about decoupling what I called horizons and cycles. Then kind of introduce the concept of time. So we have the same planning horizon, planning cycle, delivery cycle, sprint, and now I've added strategic reviews. And, kind of compare and contrast the three modes. And, my thesis would be that the planning horizon is probably the same across all three. It could be anything between 1 to 5 years. So I put 2 to 5 years. Planning cycle then for annual and hybrid, by definition, is annual. And the little asterisk there is a nod to the fact that the annual strategic objectives would be informed by breakthrough objectives, typically kind of 3 to 5 years out, perhaps. And then now you start to see the difference with full agile. You have quarterly planning cycles, quarterly delivery cycles, and then probably delivery sprints every 2 weeks, and most likely a cadence of monthly reviews, strategic reviews. And then lying in the middle, you have hybrid, which shares the same planning horizon, inherits the annual planning cycle, but then carves it into perhaps quarterly delivery cycles, sprints every 2 weeks, and then again monthly strategic reviews. So I think that helps to kind of push home the difference between them when you introduce the concept of time. But then I think you probably get to the biggest challenge of all, which is, and I tried to have fun with it to the right, but the activities in my strategic plan don't fit neatly into a delivery cycle. And to me, that's what a friend would call the heart of the artichoke. So how do you solve that? How do you solve your multiple work streams and programs and projects and perhaps, discrete pockets of agile? How do you force fit that, if you will, into the concept of delivery cycles and planning cycles? And the first question seems to be, are the resources dedicated to strategic activities? Is that what they do? In the olden days, perhaps that might be the CI teams. But if they are dedicated, then they can be managed as such. And then there are concepts of Scaled Agile Framework that seem to apply quite nicely. The notion of an agile release train, which is a team of teams. That it's a long-lived team of teams. And all they're doing is delivering strategic value, units of strategic value. And that's where you start to see, the agile language creeping in, units of strategic value, delivering strategic value early. And then the notion of a program increment, or PI, where essentially it's time boxed. And most typically, at least in tech, that's on a quarterly basis. But then, that's only some percentage of your workforce or the people that are working on your strategic activities. But what about the balance? And then again, you can kind of fork it. Is the delivery agile, in which case all you've got to do is align your existing sprints with this new notion of a delivery cycle, or you can scope to fit and then align those project dates with the dates of the delivery cycles. So, particularly that last concept enables you to transform what could be quite a complicated set of work streams and activities into something that's much simpler to manage and much more agile. So as an example, kind of pulling all of this together, we've got this notional company. It's in Q3. It's operating to a 3-year planning horizon. It's got an annual planning cycle. By definition, it's hybrid. And you can see, there are various work streams in progress in Q3. Some haven't started yet. One's been completed. And prior to that, in Q1 and Q2, a ton of work's been delivered. Not the least of all, this concept of what Gartner calls a minimum viable strategy. So in the product world, we talk about MVPs until the cows come home, minimum viable products, getting the customer value early in a project. And minimum viable strategy, guess what? It's the same thing. What portion of that historic annual strategic plan is absolutely imperative to achieving your annual goals? Where is the certainty? Can we plan that out and then leave areas that perhaps we're less certain on until later. And I think that thinking fits well with this kind of hybrid model. And then underneath that, you've got, again, this cadence of monthly reviews. So constantly checking in, how am I doing on the delivery of my work? Do I have delivery challenges or delivery risks? As well as, am I still operating to the same, to the right strategy? Has something happened that would imply I need to change course or course correct? Lastly, in between each of those delivery cycles, those quarterly delivery cycles, we have what I call a planning exercise. And again, kind of agile concepts creep in. It's logical to look back at how we did in that delivery cycle. That's the notion of a retrospective. And we're looking at both, the delivery of work as well as the delivery of realized results. And then we're using that as an opportunity to take a step back and look, are we still planning on doing the right things in the next sprint? Or again, do we need to course correct? Do we need to quickly elaborate, refine, and start some ideas? Are there other things in another backlog somewhere that perhaps we need to bring into the fold, depending on current events? So we've had this kind of concept of modes in the last few slides, and we've been hinting at certain capabilities. And I think as you kind of think through how to achieve hybrid strategic planning, there are really 6 kind of practices or capabilities that start to jump out, what I call an adaptive strategy toolkit. And along the top, I've included the modes, and it's quite interesting. Immediately you see, all of these practices are useful regardless of mode. The only difference is quite a subtle one, and that is for your delivery cycles and your delivery sprints. You could argue that annual planning is or isn't a good example, and annual planning is a sprint. It's just a long one. It's a 12-month one. Hence the green box kind of bleeding out to the left. But apart from that, all of these capabilities can be shared across the modes, and they all enable us to become much more responsive and agile. And then kind of lastly on this piece, let's take a step back and see how the pieces and the parts fit together. So this again would be a hybrid model. So down the bottom, you have your strategic plan. You've got this sense of a minimum viable strategy. That's what you're going to front load your plan with. Then by definition, you got the balance of the strategic plan, which is essentially a backlog in agile terms. And you might well have multiple backlogs, things that didn't originally make the cut for the annual strategic plan based on your situation then, your circumstances, your priorities, your objectives. But again, something might well have changed that would force you to revisit that and perhaps bring something into the fold. And then you have your delivery cycles and your delivery sprints. On top of that, you have automated insight. So that's where tools like i-nexus and other strategy execution management vendors excel in giving that real-time view into, not just how robust is the plan and how well are we executing to the work streams, but also, everything comes down to realized results at the end of the day. A project can be green for performance, but then be red in terms of it not delivering the value or the benefits it was expected. Then alongside that, you have environment scanning. And this is something that I think is getting increasing interest in the market. This is the ability to do AI-driven real-time market intelligence and competitive intelligence. And that should be able to find events that question your strategic assumptions, risks, opportunities, threats, or anything that might suggest broader market disruption beyond the scope of your annual plan. And then this notion of strategic issues. These could be risks, they could be opportunities, threats, assumptions, and maintaining that list and constantly reviewing that list as part of the strategic review, which sits above everything, taking all of that information and giving you the chance to then make quick decisions, to recognize the need for change, to consider alternative paths forward, and then to go ahead and take that quickly into implementation. So, and really, that kind of that's undesigned nice segue, into how technology can help. It amazes me that companies tackle something so strategic as strategy, with spreadsheets. And there is technology here. And that's not to say that I can't manage my sales pipeline in a spreadsheet. I can, but tools like CRM make it so much easier. And the same is true in strategy execution. So there's a genre of system out there. The market and the analysts call it strategy execution management, which is where we belong. And then there's a separate capability around adaptive or agile project management, and that's very much at the coalface, the day-to-day delivery of activities according to the plan. And then this third kind of genre of software or category of software around environment scanning, and that's the real-time kind of AI and ML, so you can get early distant warning of things that might cause you to adjust your strategy or adjust. The other thing I note on this slide is quite often SEM vendors will have some degree of that kind of day-to-day delivery capability too, but equally there are other tools out there that focus in on that area. But zooming out, those are the three kind of sets of technologies that are available today that can help you to take this leap forward in terms of evolving strategic planning. And in turn, that's a nice segue to, what would future SEM systems or smart systems look like in the future? And excuse the typo here. I'm not saying that governance is twice as important as everything else. I'm just remiss on my slides. And I would say today's technology is very much about tracking and automating. But look at the other look at the other verbs here. Discover, enrich. So, if I define a competitor in a software tool, I expect AI and ML to kick in behind the scenes and go find all the information relating to that competitor and parse it and present it to me nicely. And to do that for all of my competitors. I expect a system to not wait for me to create scenarios. I want the system to create the scenarios for me, and to not just advise me necessarily, but to make recommendations. I want it to inform me, and this is very different to software today. That's perhaps a little bit more mechanical. And then, the last slide. This is the stuff that perhaps you'll see in the next 3 to 5 years. Clearly, data is the new oil. Everything is about data, and in the strategy domain, we have so much data both within our four walls and within the broader market. And then the emergence of AI and ML, that's something that we've been looking into at i-nexus, being able to predict what might happen. How might that metric trend in the future, given certain scenarios? How successful would that project be, given the performance of prior projects of its type? Given these different portfolios, what should I do? That was back to recommending, not just advising. And now you're moving up through those blocks, into prescriptive analytics, and then ultimately into cognitive analytics. And don't think how's not going to make arbitrary decisions to kill the airflow into things. Think more Ripley, power loader, all of this just making strategy leaders and their teams much better positioned to execute. And then ultimately causing things to happen that, to some degree that can happen. If you course correct, then software should be able to intelligently communicate that across the team to changing priorities, work out what that means in terms of the and delivery and so on. And then sitting on top of that is, probably a conversational UI or even a voice UI. Again, just a very different way of interacting with applications and with data that makes software itself much more accessible. So that's the end of the presentation, and hopefully, my objective was to give you some things to think about, and as I say, some observations and some conclusions. So
that was great, James. Thank you very much. So you can receive the applause. So the question to the audience is whether there are any questions, and feel free to write them in the questions box. And to start off, let me ask you the first question, James. You mentioned the different modes of strategic planning, so annual, hybrid, full agile. Can you give examples of companies that have done full agile or hybrid in the way that you described it?
Yeah, so let's take full hybrid. So, the definition of full hybrid, it includes the annual strategic plan no longer existing. So personally, I include that for completeness, but I don't think that, I think it's a difficult approach. And I'm not aware of any companies that today, and they might well exist, I'm just talking about my own experience and what I know, companies that truly have thrown away the annual strategic plan and are just thinking on a quarterly cadence. I think most companies are hybrid already in their thinking and their aspirations. And, the real question is within hybrid, apply some kind of maturity model thinking to it. You've got some ad hoc capabilities being developed within those companies. They've yet to be systematized and are quite kind of immature, but the seeds are there. So not aware of any companies doing full agile as defined in this presentation. And I'd be keen to know, if there are any examples of that. And I think my thesis is that most of us are already hybrid, at least in terms of our actions, not necessarily in terms of our thinking.
Great, thank you. There's a question in the chat being raised by Adiba Ofunwu, and the question is, thanks James for a very informative session. How does one prevent the process of assessing the quality of deliverables/products from slowing down the strategic review process, especially if the review process will be happening monthly?
Well, I would say, in the product world, best practice would say you have something akin to a portfolio review board on a quarterly basis. So, kind of that construct to me is already there. Where perhaps it's a little bit limited is in, it being quarterly and not monthly, and perhaps not going back to the validity of the original goals and objectives. Does that answer the question?
I think it does, and if Adiba wants to come back to it, there is the opportunity. So then we will hear from this person.
Just kind of a footnote, and this is something that a colleague just reminded me of a couple of days ago. Is that full agile mode is potentially very disruptive. If you're changing tact every quarter, truly, without that kind of annual North Star. And in the product world, that isn't so easy to do when the product life cycles are much longer. So, there's definitely a challenge there to be managed.
Mm. Yeah. Next question, James, is from Julius Schnabel from Merck. Can you outline what a good example of hybrid in non-software area looks like, including key areas that are digitally supported beyond MS Office?
So would you mind repeating the question again, please, Laurent?
Yeah. Can you outline what a good example of hybrid in non-software area looks like, including key areas that are digitally supported? Question mark.
So if I understand the question correctly, it's in part probing the degree to which Agile has been applied outside of software or outside of technology.
I think maybe Robert, you can try to bring this person forward if this person.
Yeah, if you want, Julius, you can raise your hand. We can bring you on stage if you want to clarify. Or you can type. Okay, here we go. Let's bring you on stage.
Okay. Does it work, the audio, or does it not work?
Yeah, we hear you.
So we can hear you.
Yeah.
We hear you
awesome.
well.
Yeah, so thanks. Like the presentation, that was really informative. I was just asking myself practically, because it was very conceptually, if you have a company example that worked with such a model that does not work in software. For example, we as Merck Electronics, we don't really have a software-focused offering, so it's really physical products, and how such a company adapts using this model, and what they also use in terms of digital tools. I mentioned not looking at PowerPoint, Excel and stuff, but really more advanced strategic planning software.
So I'm going to give you a personal opinion. I think there are very few examples of companies that have truly applied enterprise agile beyond more traditional agile in product development, not the least of all software development. And one of the slides I removed actually shows the kind of the timeline of these different methodologies, traced all the way to the far left to Toyota and Lean, and the introduction of agile, the introduction of enterprise agile frameworks, and to now applying agile principles to strategy. I'm sure they do exist. I just can't point to them.
Okay.
In terms of technology, that's that third node, the bottom right node for adaptive work management or adaptive project management, where there is technology that very much enables and promotes kind of agile principles outside of product development. But I do think it's a challenge, and that's where the market is today in looking at how best to apply those principles outside of product development.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. I hope I answered your question.
Okay, so if there are no further questions, which it looks like, let me see in the chat. Yeah, no, that's it for the questions. Thank you very much, James.
My pleasure.
I admired your structure and the clarity of your presentation, so thanks a lot for that.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And we'll step out for a minute to change to the next speaker, so we'll see you all in a few seconds.